last minute or so, but I will probably start tapping here when you have about 10 or 15 seconds to go, so you know it's time to wrap up. But thank you each, and we'll start with you, Mr. Kobach. Is your mic on?
The green light is on. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for addressing this important topic. The amount of retail crime in Kansas is surprisingly high. We are among the top 10 states hit in terms of dollars stolen in organized retail crime. But we're not in the top 10 in violent crimes or gun crimes or many other categories of crimes. And the reason most law enforcement give for that is the I-70 corridor. Kansas and Missouri are both in the top 10. The other states in the top 10s are ones you'd expect, like California, Texas, Florida, some of the very large, more populous states. The I-70 corridor is a pipeline not only for organized retail crime, but also for drugs. And there's often a great deal of overlap between drugs and organized retail crime because the drug addicted are often recruited as boosters by the people who run the organized crime rings or networks. I thought I would give you some typical cases from Kansas, which I believe are typical not only of our state, but of most states where organized retail crime is an issue, which is increasingly all of the states. Recently, we saw the guilty plea of Frank Santa Maria in March 2023 in Kansas City. He owned a pawn shop, which was the hub of the organized crime network. Pawn shops are very frequently the hub of these networks. He had 4 boosters who stole merchandise for him. He then sold the stolen products on eBay pages. More than $100,000 in stolen products were sold for a total of over $3 million. Just to give you a glimpse of what his network looked like, they stole from Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, Target, Walgreens, and CVS. The stolen products included ink cartridges, spy point cameras, Nikon rangefinders, electric fence systems, Rogaine products, Nicorette products, over-the-counter supplements, and Crest white strips. Because the crimes were sold in both Kansas and Missouri, creating an interstate nexus, and because the amount stolen was over $250,000, which is usually the threshold these days for federal prosecutors were interested, and the case was brought in federal court. Another case in the Kansas City area, Dennis Russell pled guilty in a similar scheme. Again, a pawn shop was the hub of the organized retail crime network. 14,000 stolen items for a total of over $740,000 and sold on eBay. The types of stolen items were a little bit different. Robot vacuum cleaners, television streaming devices, and yes, textbooks. Similar network, a group of 4 to 8 boosters centered on a pawn shop. In another case, in a different case in Kansas, this one without the interstate nexus, the retail crime organization focused on a pawn shop, stealing over $200,000 from predominantly box stores. It's a fairly common pattern. So to summarize some of the commonalities, you typically see box stores being hit 2 to 3 times per week. The fence at the center is usually, in Kansas, is usually a pawn shop, but oftentimes it's just a warehouse that's used to move the goods. Almost all of the products are sold online. Factors in the legal system that are exacerbating this problem. Number one, many of the cases do not get prosecuted. A huge number do not get prosecuted due to the lack of prosecutorial capacity at the county level. Many DAs simply have too large a stack of crimes. Non-person crimes like this get moved to the bottom of the stack and consequently don't get prosecuted. Compounding this is a lack of prosecutorial capacity, which one of the other witnesses may be able to address at the federal level. And in our area, they have a $250,000 threshold. If you can't show that $250,000 has been stolen in your network of stores, then you're probably not going to get your case prosecuted. Investigative capacity is also limited. Police departments only have a limited number of detectives, and if you've got multiple stores getting hit multiple times each day, they don't have the capacity to investigate all of them. On top of that, there's a third problem in the courts. Many courts are setting bail too low for the criminals, much lower than they did in the past. And on top of that, bail bondsmen today are willing to accept a much lower percentage of the bail amount than they were, say, 20 or 30 years ago. As a combination of those two things, it's highly likely that the booster will be back out on the street before the end of the day. Policy recommendations in Kansas, as the chairman mentioned, we've tried to bring state prosecution to bear where more than one county is involved in a course of criminal conduct. I think the federal legislation before this committee is a very good step. I would also encourage, to the extent it's possible, U.S. attorney prosecutors to lower that threshold from $250,000. I just want to summarize by saying we've talked about the economic consequences, but there is a bigger consequence than the degradation, and that's the degradation of the rule of law. And I just want to end with a quick story. I went into a Walgreens recently and talked to a clerk, and her store is hit 2-3 times a day. And I asked her what she does, and she said, well, she finally decided to start following the boosters through the store, heckling them and harassing them against store policy. And I asked her why she did that, and she said because she can't stand what's happening to the reputation of her store and her neighborhood. She's fighting to preserve our culture where the rule of law is intact.
Thank you, Mr. Kobach. Ms. Mose, Mrs. Mose, we're ready for you in your 5 minutes.